Chapter 15. Nothing but dust. Hallie. Frost laced the grasses and underbrush the next morning, and with each step Hallie and Ben took through the trees, a pleasant crunching followed. It was the loudest sound. For Hallie, the memories of that day 3 years ago kept her mouth closed. She didn't know why Ben was so quiet, but ever since he'd woken up after falling onto the beach, he hadn't had much to say. They'd been traveling along the route Zeke had given them for at least a quarter of an hour, though that was an estimation on Hallie's part. Sometimes she'd wished she'd bought herself an actual working pocket watch, but that was only in times such as these. She rubbed her thumb over the cover of her broken one. Her mind reviewed the last passage from the Gate of Time book as they walked. It kept her busy, at least. The Gate of Time, for which this book is aptly named, is something I still find curious. Having studied it from a distance, I was able to discern very little about its power and purpose here on this planet. The Yalves are also less willing to speak of the object, as it has something to do with their religion, though not all Yalves follow their gods' edicts and bylaws fastidiously regarding the gate. Hallie found Jasper Morgan's words just as curious as he found whatever the gate was. She'd read about the essences, or what little there was about them in the university library, but not a single text referenced the gate. The most I can get out of the current Lord Elder is Anohim Karaten Amhatoro. While I'm well served in their language, I'm unable to translate anything except for the god's name, Toro. The same can be said about the inscription upon the gate's stones, Anara Yas Esvanakta. I believe it has something to do with the essences, but those beings, like the gate, are a mystery to myself at this time. It was the words even Morgan was unable to translate that intrigued her most. The language predated the landing for certain, but if Morgan had no idea what the words meant, how could Hallie hope to figure them out? And then there was the bit about how he believed the gate and essences were connected. Stars, she wished they were in Mirai already. Then she could ask all the questions she pleased. It had taken her hours to translate those paragraphs the previous evening, once Zeke had gone to bed. She still wondered why Professor Christie had tasked her with this, even if she couldn't decipher some of the words. How was this supposed to help her with the Yalves? As she and Ben continued to search, sunlight peeked through the trees and caught on the crystallized flora around them. "Such a pretty flower," Hallie cooed at the red and gold plant in front of her. It looked like two different stars piled on top of one another, the gold underneath. She paused and fished out her sketchpad and pencil as Ben halted and looked back. "This place is something out of a dream, isn't it?" Ben mused as he holstered his electro-pistol. He reached out and touched the flower in question. "Makes you wonder why we haven't explored this continent more." Turning a new page, she gave him a smile. "I'd say the Bay of Storms and dragons might deter the weak of heart." He laughed. "True. I still can't believe you and Kase ran into something like that and lived. I wonder how the Yalves deal with them." She held her tongue to the side of her mouth as she sketched a sloppy outline of the star-shaped flower before her. Jack always teased she'd bite off her tongue one day. She shook the memory of his laughter out of her mind. Focus on the flower. Focus on the petals. She wished she knew what type it was. After she sketched it, she'd grab a few to take with her. They would be nice to put in a cup to brighten up the lavatory. Kase would probably think it's silly, but he was busy fueling up the ship with Ebba at present anyway. "I'm still as shocked as you are." Hallie finished her quick sketch and returned her supplies to her satchel before snatching a few of the flowers. "But the Yalves have their power, whatever that might be. It probably comes in handy from time to time." "True," Ben said with a shrug. "Guess we'll find out soon." They continued walking a bit further and finally found one of the statues Zeke and Kase had described. Hallie sketched it on the same sheet as the flower before they continued on, finding more statues. They'd finished inspecting one more corroded than the last when Alli saw something out of the corner of her eye, a glimmer of light through the trees, like a reflection. "I think that's it." She pointed to the gleam. As they inched through the trees, the sight unfolding in front of them made her stomach tighten and her eyes mist over. The structure was carved out of the cliff face, just as the others had said. The glimmer of light, though, was the Zuprium accents reflecting the early morning light. "Oh, stars," Alli whispered. "I can't believe I'm actually seeing this with my own eyes. A real Yalvin temple." Crack. Alli whipped her head around, eyes scanning the ground and surrounding trees. Nothing. No animals, no crashing trees. Ben pulled out his pistol, sparks flying from the tip. "What was that?" he asked, finger hovering over the trigger. A bird the color of rubies flew past and landed on a limb near the tree line. They waited a beat, 2, 3, but nothing else moved. She breathed out slowly, the soft exhale joining the light breeze across her cheeks. "Probably just a branch falling?" They turned back towards the structure, and Alli caught the words etched into the first archway. "Stars, this really is amazing. Just look at this. This dialect probably dates back to, well, much further than mankind's first landing on Yalvara." Each letter stood about a hand's breadth in height, some of the edges eroded with time. Ben hadn't released his grip on the pistol. "What does it say?" Alli shrugged and pulled out her supplies. "I could probably give you a rough translation, but it's better if I copy it down and reference one of the books I brought, to be sure." As her pencil whisked across the page, a faint whispering tickled her ears. She whipped her head around again, trying to find the source. Nothing. "Did you hear that?" Ben, who had been running his fingers over the stone bricks, turned. "What?" She shook her head. "Never mind." The whispering still tickling her ears, she finished copying the roughly carved letters and put away her supplies. She was probably just tired. Last night hadn't been very restful. "From my research, this courtyard would have been used for cleansing oneself," she said as she stood and followed Ben through the archway. "The ancient Yalvs believed these places to be sacred, and if they wanted to use the temple, they needed to present a clean body and heart." Ben prowled the edges of the small courtyard and stopped at the door. "Amazing, really. My ancestors built this." His words were whispered and barely audible above the wind, but Alli had caught them. Her heart stammered in her chest, cool shock tingling her limbs. You're what?" Ben spun, his pistol flinging sparks. Alli leapt out of the way, falling to the rough stone ground and scraping her palm. Fresh blood bubbled up through the small punctures. Ben put away his weapon and bent down beside her. "Oh, stars, Alli, I'm sorry. I thought I heard something and then I just reacted. I'm glad you're okay." Alli wiped her hands on her trousers and pushed herself up. "It's all right, but what you said—" She trailed off as Ben straightened and fiddled with the end of his untucked shirt beneath his watch uniform jacket. The morning sunlight made his hair and eyes practically glow as he looked at her, his lips pressed together. Finally, he sighed. "I'm part Yalvin, through my mother's side. That's one of the reasons I was so keen on heading this mission." Hallie's heart beat in her chest as excitement thrummed through her veins. "Really? I can't believe you haven't said something before. I have so many questions. But of course, if you'd rather keep that private, I'm sorry, you probably don't want to talk about it." "It's all right," Ben said with a shrug. "I don't know much. My mother died when I was young, and Father never liked talking about her." That's awful." Alli swallowed the words, aching to climb out her mouth. She just wanted to know more. She'd always wanted to meet someone who had any connections to the Yalvs, just so she could ask them all sorts of questions. She'd been only 16 when she'd found the painting of a woman as pale as first moon, with midnight hair and glowing golden eyes in the attic of her family's inn. Her father had said it was someone her great-grandmother had known, but Alli found the blush in her father's cheeks suspicious. Jack had dismissed it, and Hallie had nearly forgotten about it until she'd gotten to the university. In her required history course, a nearly identical portrait graced a page in the Yalvin culture section of the textbook. That's when she knew she had to change her focus to Yalvin studies. Her great-grandmother had known one of them, and by the stars, Hallie had to know more. Crack. The sound echoed against the cliff face, and Hallie flinched. Gracious day, good thing we aren't standing under that tree. Louder whispers took her breath away as the wind picked up. We can go a little deeper, Jack laughed. The strange light was a bit further, right, Niels? Hallie shook her head. She could almost see Niels's flashing smile in return, and smell the bit of sweat he'd worked up trekking through the cave. She inhaled the gritty dust as it floated from the ceiling of the old mine. Their words echoed in the darkness looming ahead. Her own voice was a shadow of what it had been then. But Papa said the mines aren't stable. Niels's voice joined the others. Come on, Hal. Where's your sense of adventure? Yeah, Jack added. If you want to turn back, go ahead. But you can't have any gold then. Except what they found was far from gold. She blinked. What was going on? Why did it feel like she was there, back in the mountains? Was her mind playing tricks on her? Because of what today was? Hallie looked over at Ben. Did you hear? But he simply stumbled toward the door, his face as white as the snow topping the Nardens. She followed, her footsteps muffled with the foliage covering the courtyard floor. Vines grew through the cracks in the arched doorway carved into the cliff face. Brushing her hand against the vines, she frowned at the rough touch of the plant itself. She pulled a bit away, and her breath caught in her chest. All the unease from the past few minutes melted away. Carvings decorated the stone, each one telling an ancient story. Bits of her own blood speckled the stone as she continued to inspect the artwork. The story engraved on the one in front of her told her of a battle with an enormous lizard-like creature. The wings on the monster spread toward the heavens, and miniature carvings of people waved swords. A dragon, she breathed. She peeked over at Ben, who stared blankly at the door itself. When he noticed her looking, pink colored his cheeks. He ran a hand over the surface of the rotting wood. I just can't believe they're actually real. I know. Hallie gripped the unadorned Zuprium handle and pulled. The door creaked and got caught on the courtyard's overgrowth, but with Ben's help she tugged it open. Holy stars and heavens! If only Professor Christie could have been here with me. As she and Ben stepped over the threshold, a soft sobbing reached her ears, the cries jagged and gaining in pitch. Hello? Her voice shook. Ben looked at her funny, his eyes boring into hers. You heard that too, then? In the dim light coming through the slats in the massive door, she could just see the back of the room. It was barely larger than the cockpit on the Eudora, smelling of dust. It reminded her of something else, but the cries got louder, drowning out every other sense. She spun in the small space, searching wildly for the source of the voice, but there was no one else there. Only swords? The arched and crumbling room was full of all kinds. Intricate carvings decorated the blades. On most, they looked to be some form of Yalvin, but there were too many unfamiliar letters and figures to be sure. Each pommel had a gemstone square in the center. They winked at her like stars. It's an armory, Ben said, bending down to inspect one. The archway stone had carved battle scenes. It has to be. As suddenly as it began, the crying fell away. She barely heard it now, almost like it had been smothered in cotton. Or like it had never been there at all. Grunting from the effort, she picked up one of the blades. The grip was warm, and it must have weighed nearly 15 or 20 pounds. The blade was a silvery metal, mixed with telltale bronze-colored Zuprium. I guess you're right. She glanced at the others. all the same except for the jewels in the pommels. Each one was a different sort. The sword she'd chosen had a deep green one. The gem's color reminded her of mazilbury leaves in her mother's garden. It wasn't jade, but it might have been an emerald. "There's no way we can carry them all back," she said. "But we'll bring Kase and Zeke next time. They'll be excited to use those impressive muscles of theirs for once." Ben laughed. "Zeke, maybe. Kase, on the other hand." He grabbed a sword with a ruby pommel and gave it an experimental swing. The metal screeched and sparked on the stone as it met the wall. "Be careful!" Ben held the edge up to his eyes. Didn't even leave a scratch. "Let's head back, shall we?" She'd just stepped on the threshold of the doorway and pushed the rotting wood aside when someone screamed, an unholy, otherworldly death scream. It rent the air and stuck into her very being, like she'd fallen onto one of those beautiful swords. She stumbled out of the armory, nearly losing her footing. She'd heard that scream before, 3 years ago. Her heart nearly leapt out of her chest. "Jack? Niels?" Was it a ghost? Her imagination? Another scream, but not the one she knew. This one came from the direction of the forest. "That's Kase!" Ben yelled. He sprinted for the trees, sword held at his side. Holding tightly to her own sword with her good arm, she ran. She probably shouldn't run with a sharp weapon, lest she'd trip, but she didn't stop. She wouldn't let anyone else die. Not today. "Please, please let everything be okay." Dirt and leaves kicked up and floated past her as she stumbled back toward the ship. She ignored the frosted branches and vines licking her face and the sting of thorns catching on her trousers, the crisp air biting at the open seam. More screaming and shouting met her ears. Even with complete terror flooding her veins, she couldn't mistake that for anything but Kase's voice. Heart pounding, lungs wheezing, she rolled her ankle in the sprint. Blast the too soft, boggy ground. Her ankle burned like fire and embers and shocks and bolts, but she ignored it as she righted herself, still clasping the sword in one hand, limping faster than a shooting star. "The pistols aren't working!" Kase shouted, his voice strained. Alli burst through the last of the underbrush and stopped dead in her tracks. Standing at nearly 7 feet tall, a form seemingly carved from rough stone loomed over Kase, his curls peeking out from behind the thing's monstrous arm. The thing Kase fought was missing part of its nose. Alli's breath froze in her chest. Its honed arms and legs swung at Kase, who ducked and rolled out of the way. Alli's mouth opened in a silent scream, like her larynx was made from simple cloth as she took in the thing's face. The stone statue was even more beautiful in its own way now that it was moving. The carver must have taken years to put in every detail of the Stoneman's face, with its handsomely shaped features, its straight brow and determined mouth. Animated, it almost looked as if it was a human trapped within stone skin, the veins laced with gold. All the moss and mold had fallen away. It was also a born fighter, complete with rippling muscles, and there were more of them. Thundering footfalls echoed in her ears as 3 others smashed through the underbrush to her left. "Alli!" Kase shot a bolt of electricity, dodging the stone arm swiping at his head. Hadn't the Stars idiot just screamed the pistols didn't work? "Ship, go!" But she couldn't move. All she could do was watch in frozen horror as Zeke wielded the machete from the ship's storeroom, joining Ben fighting 2 stonemen. When the soldier hit one of their faces, only a little sliver of rock chipped away from his foe's cheekbone. With his wild swipes, Ben clearly didn't know how to use the sword he'd chosen, but a chunk of the statue's hand flew off and hit Zeke's arm, ripping his uniform, blood spewing forth. The soldier hollered, pulling that arm to his chest, but he kept fighting with the other. Crashing, burning stars! "Alli, go!" Kase flung the useless pistol in the direction of his monster. It hit, but it only stopped the creature for a breath. It seemed more confused than injured. Kase scooped up a few rocks from the ground and threw them. Again, the monster seemed surprised for only a moment, but it was enough for Kase to spot Alli over the thing's shoulder. "Get to the blasted ship!" He wasn't looking as the creature pulled back an arm to swing again. Oh, stars! Oh, stars! It was going to knock his head clean off his shoulders. Her thoughts raced faster than a motor coach, faster even than the Eudora Jade before the storm. In her mind's eye she imagined the blood, saw it soak Kase's curls as his head rolled upon the gore-streaked grass. Just like the blood had coated Jack's face when the rescue crew had freed his body from the rubble. The corners of her eyes burned. She couldn't stop the Stonemen. She didn't have any sort of weapon to... The sword. The weapon she carried. She rushed forward as Kase turned. He opened his mouth to make what Alli presumed would be his final roar in the face of death. With all her strength, she swung the sword gripped in both her hands, nailing the creature right in its neck. It cracked all the way through. Heavy with momentum, the head slid from the monster's shoulders. It didn't scream. No blood spewed forth. Alli stumbled and nearly impaled herself, but strong arms gripped her waist. She did scream, her voice finally working once more, fighting the thing's grip with all her might. The Stoneman had grabbed her. It didn't have a head, but it had still grabbed her. Alli, snap out of it! Kase. Those were Kase's arms around her waist, Kase's voice in her ear. She whipped her head between the dead Stoneman, Kase, and the sword stuck in the ground beside its rocky corpse. Is it dead? It's dead. Now get on the ship! Still breathing hard, she nodded and obeyed, pulling away to run for the steps. Kase grabbed her fallen weapon and went to hack a third monster, joining Zeke and Ben's battle. Let's go! He yelled. Come on! Alli didn't look, only flung herself up the steps and onto the ship. Ebba was at a cockpit side window, her jagged breaths audible over the Stonemen trying to climb the side of the ship. A few moments later, the stairway slammed shut, footsteps pounding down the corridor. Skibbs abandoned his sword on a seat and lunged for the pilot controls. Lift off now, Skibbs! Ebba! The electrobomb! Kase shoved Hallie's strange sword and a bleeding Zeke into her arms. Ripped from forearm to waist, his uniform sleeve clung to the blood gushing from a cut just below his elbow. She helped the man to a chair and laid the sword beside him, her head whirling with adrenaline and terror. Blow them to the stars! Kase shouted as the Eudora Jade jerked into the air. Alli barely caught herself on the back of one of the seats as wind rushed into the cockpit. The code won't work! Ebba pounded the dash. Kase flung himself out of his seat and Alli leapt out of his way. His voice was harsh, guttural, scared. Why did they put this blasted thing all the way over here? He smashed a sequence of buttons as the ship lurched to one side. Alli dug her fingernails into the soft material of the seat. Ben tugged on the steering control and Zeke moaned. One's grabbed onto the engine! Ebba's terrified sob was muffled by her good hand. Kase cursed and pounded another button as Hallie's stomach lurched into her chest. They're going to take us down. They'll pulverize our bones until we're nothing but dust. But then the air crackled. The ship rocked when the Stonemen released their prize, and as the Eudora rose higher, the ground exploded below them. Chapter 16. Just in Case. Kase. After a thorough search around the new campsite well to the east of the statues, Kase wasn't the only one avoiding the usual dinner of dried beef and vegetables. He and Skibbs hadn't found any statues or any remnant of the Yalves in this part of the forest, on the edge of that same endless bog. Shucks, how far did it extend? Kase was just lucky they found a rather dry stretch, not drowning in a foot deep of murky water. When Skibbs got up to go stir the fire, Zeke volunteered to go hunting the next morning for something else to eat, insisting he was more than capable of trapping or shooting something with one arm. Always the soldier, never admitting defeat in the face of pain. When Alli had finished sloppily stitching Zeke's gash, she'd volunteered to gather some edible plants, but Ebba and Skibbs hadn't said much other than to agree with the others. Those two went to bed as soon as night fell, and Kase couldn't blame them. He hadn't thought anything could be as terrifying as the crash in the storm, or the dragon. But nothing could have prepared him for deadly stone statues. He played with the bandage wrapped around his left wrist, staring into the campfire until his eyes began to burn. He'd only acquired a small scratch, thank the moons. It could have been so much worse. If Alli hadn't swung that sword... "Kase!" His brother had a foot on the bottom stair, holding his injured arm to his chest. "Yeah? Will you take first watch? You're the least injured out of all of us." Kase waved his hand. "Fine. Thank you." Zeke limped up the stairs. At the top, he turned to Alli, who sat against a tree at the edge of the firelight, her injured ankle wrapped tightly. Not broken, only twisted. "Alli, you coming in?" The girl flinched, turning toward Zeke slowly, as if in a dream. She shook her head, a few loose strands of hair floating around her face. She gripped that sword again, the weapon that had saved him. She hadn't let it out of her sight since the fight. The one Skibbs had grabbed still lay on the floor of the cockpit. They'd inspect it more thoroughly in the morning. Kase looked back toward Alli. Though he'd only known her a little over a month, Kase had learned she would draw whenever she could, but especially when she was nervous, much like when he ruffled his already messy curls. But tonight, the sketchpad was nowhere in sight. Maybe Alli could take first watch. She didn't look like she'd be moving any time soon, much less sleeping. This side of her made him pause. He'd only seen the fiery or the quirky Alli. This one was new. He didn't know what to call it. Maybe it was a little like Zeke's battle fright. "Alli!" Her grip tightened on the sword hilt. "Do you want to take... You know what, I'll be right back. Can you keep an eye out for a minute?" She tilted her head, but nodded. Bounding up the steps, he whisked down the hallway, ducking into the room he shared with his brother and Skibbs. "Kase, what are you—" He ignored Zeke. Skibbs was already asleep, which wasn't surprising. He'd been more or less like that since he stumbled onto the beach. Zeke said he was still healing, but Kase thought it was more likely that his brother's medical cocktail wasn't as effective as he'd hoped it would be. "You're supposed to be keeping watch." Zeke sat up in his bed. Kase threw open his trunk and pulled out the pilot's jacket he'd stuffed there earlier. He went over to his bed and stuck his hand underneath the pillow for the book wedged between the mattress and the wall, then left the room, Zeke's mutterings floating in the air. Before he made it out onto the stairs, a strong hand gripped his shoulder and spun him around. Zeke. His bandage would need to be changed soon based on the small red blots leaking through the cloth. He narrowed his sharp hazel eyes, and he looked so much like their father in that moment, Kase had to do a double-take. "What do you want?" Kase asked, still pulling. Zeke squeezed until Kase winced. "You can't leave your post, especially after what happened today." Kase fought the urge to roll his eyes. "Hallie's out there, remember?" he hissed. "She might want to read." Zeke's eyebrows lifted as Kase held up the book. "Make sure she doesn't stay out there too long." When his brother headed back to their room, Kase turned toward the exit. As he left the ship, he leaped down the last few stairs and strode toward Alli. He was only doing this because she'd saved his life earlier that day, and the look on her face told him she needed something to distract her. Kase slowed as he approached. She didn't move, didn't even acknowledge him. Her eyes were fine-spun glass, staring straight ahead at something unseen. He cleared his throat. "Alli?" Not even a twitch. He lowered himself to the ground opposite the sword, trying to quell the flame of anger itching to catch his kindling thoughts. He set the book and jacket down beside him to give him time. She'd saved his life today, and it had probably been the first time she'd ever fought anything like that, let alone killed something. Alli seemed like the kind of person to spare a spider, probably so she could sketch it. He faced her, knees pulled up to his chest, and picked up the jacket with one hand, holding it out. "Here, at least take this. You'll freeze to death without it." The sword twitched as the glaze melted from her eyes, and she turned at last. Kase ached to run a hand through his hair, but she still hadn't taken the jacket from him. He decided he didn't know how to deal with this Alli. He enjoyed arguing with her, that he could do well, but this was something else entirely. "Come on, it's the least I can do." Kase tossed the leather into her lap. She looked down at it, then back up at him. "I'm fine." Her voice was raspy from disuse. She coughed. Kase's fingers curled into fists. "Why don't you go in and sleep?" Hallie's eyes flashed for a moment, then softened. She gathered the leather close with her free hand, hugging it to her chest like a child with a teddy bear. I can't. If your shoulder hurts too much, I can—" He could what? Help her put it on? She wasn't 5, for moon's sake. The tip of the sword moved in the dry grass as she threw the jacket at his feet. It landed with a soft thump. "I don't need it." "We've all been through a lot today. Keep your temper." "Look," Kase tried again. "I'm sitting here because you carved a blasted monster up with that sword. Take the jacket. It's warm." Her mouth quirked. "I did keep it from knocking those curls off your head." "Progress?" His lips pulled up at one end just a little. He handed the jacket back to her, and she took it, laying it across her knees. She still wouldn't take her hand off the sword. "You like Marasi, right?" Alli tilted her head. "Yes, but what does that have to do—" He picked up the Odyssey and held it out. She halted when she saw the cover. Instead of taking it from him, smiling, or even acknowledging it, she stared. Kase's arm ached. Marasi loved his thorough analysis of ancient texts, in addition to the translation itself, which made for great reading material, but it wasn't exactly light, on the mind or the arm. Was she not going to take it? After another agonizing few seconds, he set the book down beside her, and prayed the soggy ground wasn't too soggy. "I thought you might want to read my copy. As thanks for today." She didn't say anything, so he pushed himself to his feet. Maybe if he left her alone, she'd take the hint and go inside. As soon as he stepped towards the fire, she choked out a sob. "Thank you." Her voice cracked. He froze. The crying women weren't a strong suit of his, but blast, he couldn't leave her there. He slowly turned back, going over their conversation in his mind. He hadn't said anything offensive, had he? Even if he had, why would she thank him for that? Streams of tears dampened her cheeks as she met his eyes. She swiped at them with the cuff of her dirt-streaked sleeve. "Thank you, but I don't want it. Not today. Jack—" She sniffled and finally let go of the sword as she buried her face in her hands. Kase shifted his weight from foot to foot. What was he supposed to do? Anna had been the only girl he'd cared about enough to comfort when she cried, but that hadn't been often, and he'd been terrible at it besides. She'd said so herself. Alli lifted her wet face, her nose crinkling as she sniffled hard. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to—" Kase chewed on his lip and crouched down in front of her, putting a hand on the laces of her boot. That seemed safe. "Hey, it's okay. I didn't mean to upset you. For once." She shook her head. "Not your fault. For once." Her small smile mirrored his. "There we go. Almost back to normal. Maybe. It won't hurt my feelings if you don't want to read the book. I thought you'd like it, that's all. Didn't realize it'd make you cry." She laughed, but the tears didn't stop. He resisted the urge to wipe them from her cheeks with his fingertips. She wouldn't appreciate that, but the thought of her soft skin made his stomach clench. Where had that feeling come from? This was Alli. She gripped the leather jacket. "No, it's just that— Actually, will you sit here with me?" "You're not going to slap me again, are you?" Alli shook her head and bit her lip. "I don't want to be alone. Not tonight." She took a breath. You can sit on the other side of the tree, if you want, just in case." He was uncomfortably aware of an icy burning in his chest. A new feeling. He didn't know if he liked it or not. In case of what? Just in case I do have the urge to slap you? That'll give you time to run." A laugh bubbled in his throat, but he sat to her left, facing the other side of the campsite. Towards the bog, the light from the fire stretched and yawned, the flickering creating shapes in the darkness. Kase shivered. He didn't know how long the silence stretched out, but the soft creaking of burning wood eased the tension in his shoulders. Just a little bit. "Did we make a mistake coming out here?" she asked. Kase turned so he could see her out of the corner of his eye. Yet instead of seeing her, he could almost feel the rain fall on his cheeks and watch the greenie's body slide off the hangar roof. Stone bit into his knees as he caught the boy. He smelled the metallic tang of blood as it soaked his trousers, and heard the desperation in his own voice as he shouted for someone to get a medic. "I've lost count of all my mistakes. Why not add this one to the pile?" When he didn't answer, she continued, "I didn't agree to this blindly, but all I left behind was a stupid letter, just ink on paper." Kase's fingers gripped the stiff material of his pants. He blinked away the shadows of bloodstains, of a cheek stinging from his father's backhand. "Me too." It might not have been the most eloquent answer, but Alli accepted it all the same. Kase knew his motivation for coming out here. He didn't have a choice. It was fly to who blasting knew where or face charges. But what had motivated her? What had motivated anyone? Why had Zeke gone blindly along with Jove's plan? What made Skibbs leave Lucy behind? And Ebba? What had she to lose by saying no to this insanity? Alli didn't say anything for a long while, so long that Kase thought she'd fallen asleep against the tree. "Today is the 3rd anniversary of Kase whipped his head toward her. The fire laced her profile with golden light, highlighting the tears dampening her cheeks. He hadn't realized she'd started crying once more. Did that make him a bad person? 3rd anniversary of what? "My brother's death," she choked. "Jack was my twin. He died. And now my parents probably think I'm dead too." His stomach felt like the Stonemen had come back and punched it. I'm sorry." She shook her head. "I hate when people say that. You didn't kill him." Kase chewed the inside of his cheek. He knew exactly what she meant. He'd felt the same way after Anna died. Alli sniffed. "That was rude of me. You were... I can never shut up when I need to." "Me either." Alli wiped away the ghost of a tear. "Our favorite story, Jack's and mine, was the Odyssey. I didn't mean to... Thank you for letting me borrow your book." Kase ran a hand through his hair. "You're welcome." Although he was a blasted star's idiot for bringing up terrible memories, accidentally or not. He didn't know what to say. For once, he didn't want to break the soft truce they'd found. But then again, he selfishly wanted to ask her about it. He knew he shouldn't. He didn't like anyone nosing in his own situation, but for the first time he might have found someone who understood. Other than his brothers, anyway. Alli sniffed again. "It's odd. You don't just lose a person when they die. You lose a laugh, a look, a touch. You lose a past, and a present, and a future." Kase traced a seam on his trousers. I guess." Her shirt scraped against the trunk as she turned toward him. His eyes stayed fixed to the seam he fiddled with. "You lose an entire lifetime, and you'll never get it back. Just... I don't know how..." Hallie's voice softened even further as she cut herself off. "Sorry. I'm just sitting here babbling." His hand froze in place as he looked into her red-rimmed eyes. "You're not babbling?" His stomach clenched. "You're right." His heart climbed into his throat, and tears pricked the corners of his eyes. Memories of happier times, of laughter, of singing in the rain, of a tiny hand held fast in his, flashed in his mind. His words were choked, clawing to reach the air. I lost my sister a few years back." Hallie's hand clenched as she said, "Oh, yeah." She brushed her fingers across the sleeve of his jacket and gave a low, coarse chuckle. "We're not so different after all." Kase didn't respond. After a moment, Hallie cleared her throat. "What was her name?" Kase grasped his curls, but he still answered. "Anna." "A pretty name," Hallie murmured, but it seemed more to be a comment to herself. Silence fell over them for a moment before she spoke up again. "It's not fair." Hallie shifted, reaching around the trunk and grasping his shoulder. She looked him straight in the eye. Her watery gaze was bright gold in the firelight. "It's not fair that the only thing we can do now is believe both Jack and Anna found their way among the stars. Not that it helps us feel any better. It's a stupid thought anyway, thinking that our souls travel in the heavens after a burning." She trailed off, but Kase didn't have anything else to add. For once, he and Hallie were of one mind. He understood burnings were a way of making the living feel like there was something else after this life. At a burning, mourners gazed into the sky above, watching the smoke of the deceased make their final journey. He knew that back on First Earth, many cultures buried their dead. But after landing on Yalvara, the ritual of funeral pyres made a resurgence, maybe because this wasn't their native planet. The people of Jade belonged elsewhere. The spirits of the departed would soar among the stars and find their way back to humanity's true home. That was what some people believed anyway. It might be easier than accepting the truth that those who died never returned to the realm of the living. Because Hallie was right. You didn't just lose a person. You lost a lifetime. After stars knew how long, Hallie pushed herself to her feet. "Thank you for the jacket, and listening. But I'll try to get some... I think I'll go inside now." Kase watched her climb the stairs, wishing she wouldn't, but unable to think of anything to make her stay. Still recovering from the Stonemen attack, the crew of the Eudora Jade stayed one more night at the same campsite. The next morning, Kase trapped a few squirrels with purple streaks in their tails, which were much tastier than Kase expected, and Hallie found a cayenne-berry bush. The combination of the squirrel meat and the berries were intriguing, and Kase ate it with gusto. He didn't know if Hallie's cooking had improved or if he simply didn't care any longer. It was better than Star's awful beef stew, no matter which way he looked at it. While the crew ate more of their dinner than they had the previous night, conversation still lacked. The near-death experience replayed on loop in Kase's head, and with each successive sound in the trees he cricked his neck, praying it wasn't the Stonemen back for revenge. He just hoped they wouldn't follow them across the bog and to Mirai. First Moon had finally made an appearance by the time Ebba's voice, soft and barely above a whisper, shattered the delicate silence.
I know you probably don't care, but I feel like I need to tell you all before anything.
She took a deep breath.
My brother Aaron has an incurable heart disease, and the money from this mission was supposed to help my parents with the financial burden. I made a deal with the Medics Guild. They'll go to debtor's prison without it.
She sniffed a little and wiped her eyes.
Didn't realize I might die even when the High Guardsman said it was dangerous. I'm a sterning fool, 'cause I thought this was an easy way to fix it all.
Her last words thickened with emotion and broke off. The fire reflected in her dark eyes, and she pushed her hair back from her face. With a soft sniff, she wiped again at the tears dribbling down her cheek.
Thought you should know.
Zeke sat straight up.
Did they not file for aid with the guild? Surely they would understand.
Ebba shrugged.
They didn't qualify.
Zeke heaved a sigh, but he didn't add anything else. Alli, who sat beside her, squeezed her shoulder and let go. An incurable disease? A wave of shame washed over Kase's body. He remembered how he'd rejected her request to be on his ground crew, thinking she was just a kid. He gritted his teeth. What a blasted helveter he was. But the words he needed to say jammed in his throat. Apologizing now wouldn't make a difference. The silence lasted until Zeke snapped bits of a stick and threw each piece into the fire with swift precision. As the flames licked the new wood, the soft crackling echoed in the clearing. Once he finished, he said,
Well, I'm here because Jove asked me. I trusted he knew what he was doing, but even he couldn't have predicted this.
Kase chewed on the inside of his cheek, fiddling with his ring. He knew why he'd come along, and selfishly he knew he couldn't return to Kaivenna without a successful mission. By the stars, he wasn't even close to a decent human being.
If we aren't successful, there's a chance
He dug his heel in the dirt as 4 pairs of eyes burrowed into the top of his head.
I made a mistake. A terrible one, and I thought coming on this mission would fix it. But what's even more ridiculous is that I just wanted to get out of that blasted city. I hated it.
He deepened the furrow his boot had made. The partial truth rolled off his tongue like fire. He peeked up and caught Zeke's sad smile. He swallowed. Ebba nodded.
I never liked it much either. We moved there because of Aaron, though Pa says it was for his art, but things are worse off for my family. Now I'd give nearly anything to be back there in that sloping mess of a cottage in the lower city, with my brothers. That's not exactly what I meant. Did she not hear the first part of my botched confession?
You don't need to worry. Zeke dusted his hands on his trousers and winced as he moved his injured arm.
Jove will make sure they're taken care of. Lucy's pregnant?
Skibbs's choked words were a lightning bolt in a summer storm, but instead of electricity burning through Kase, his breath froze in his chest.
What?
Skibbs's laugh was wry and jarring, opposite of his tone moments before.
We were going to use the money to run away and start over. How stupid of me to think I could do this. I can't remember hours on end, and my head hurts like bursting suns for the others. I told her I'd come home, but I don't think I'll...
He cut himself off. After a few more moments of complete silence, he stood.
I need to go. Ben?
Kase's words were lost in the clacking of his boots on the metal stairs. He clenched his jaw. He should get up and try to talk to him, but his feet wouldn't move, shock rooting them in place.
It all made sense now. Why he was so defensive about Lucy, and it left a bitter aftertaste in Kase's mouth, like an acidic bile and the burning smell of Yalvar fuel. He understood the desperation at wanting to escape. He understood the desire. But how could Skibbs have been so reckless? What did he think would happen once her parents discovered she was pregnant out of wedlock? She'd be tossed out of any respectable social circles, and she was the sole heiress to her family's fortune. But what I did was worse. The Greenies paralyzed because of me. As egregious as that was, it wasn't the only thing bothering him. The minutes waned away in silence, and in those moments when no one else made a sound save for the fire, something deep down in Kase sparked and grew into an angry, roaring blaze. The strength of it caught him by surprise. Maybe it was his own childhood rearing its ugly head, the abandonment he'd felt, or the pain and abuse he'd endured. But whatever it was, it flooded him with rage. Kase didn't know how much money Jove had promised Skibbs, but if their situations were reversed, there wasn't anything in heaven or hell that would tempt Kase to leave his unborn child and almost fiancé, much less leave them to the mercy of the bloodthirsty Jadian elites. Kase's eyes burned as he stared into the flames, willing his blood to stop boiling. Because if it didn't, he might do something stupid and knock his friend senseless for the third time. His chest heaved even as he tried to calm himself. The only thing Kase could do was make sure they made it home in one piece, and calm down, and breathe, and not lose his temper. That list was entirely too long. Alli tucked her knees to her chin, wrapping her arms around them. She hadn't said a word during the whole exchange. The only sign she'd acknowledged any of it was her silent shoulder squeeze at the beginning of it all. The anger drained out of him like water through fingers as he watched her. He was a wreck every year on the anniversary of Anna's death, and he wished he could do or say something else to comfort her. But even the Odyssey hadn't helped the previous night. It wasn't long before both Zeke and Ebba headed inside, Kase volunteering for first watch once more. Not only did the horrors of their last weeks haunt his thoughts, but the evening's conversation played in his head on repeat. With each successive run-through, shame and anger rolled over him like waves of the sea, each one dragging him under harder than the last. He'd thought leaving Kaivenna would cure him of the past, but he was wrong. So very wrong. And he had no one to blame but himself. Maybe his father was right. Maybe he wasn't mature enough to make the decisions in his life. Whenever given leave to do so, he screwed up worse than the last time. Kase? Hallie's voice snapped him out of the vicious cycle. He took in her form at the foot of the stairs. Her jacket nearly reached her knees, where thick brown trousers were tucked into her boots that were peeling at the heels. She fiddled with a button on her jacket, her hair falling out of a loose braid and casting shadows on her face, but she didn't push the strands away. I'm only here for the money, for myself, because I'm too much of a coward to face my past. That's it. So if you're ridiculous, I must be a stars-blasted fool. She disappeared up the stairs, each step ringing in the silence, and her words joined the cacophony in his head. Chapter 17. Breathe slowly. Kase. Pulling his goggles over his eyes, Kase readied the Eudora for takeoff. Today was the day. After surls, storms, dragons, stonemen, and 3 nights spent in a bog praying the ship didn't sink, they would reach Haddon's Pass. They'd determined the river that would lead them to the pass had become the bog they'd been in, taken over with time.
It was the only thing that made sense with the mountains in the distance. With each passing day, those towering giants had grown larger and darker. If Jove's map and Hallie's assumptions were correct, Kase would be flying the ship through the pass and into the Yalvin city of Mirai by dinner. Maybe it was the thought of the blasted mission finally ending, but for the first time in ages, Kase's hands didn't shake as he gripped the steering control. Skibbs silently followed his pre-flight protocol, and with his help, the ship was in the air within minutes. Through the missing front window, Kase studied the mountains and forest before them. When they passed the 1-and-5-minute mark and only a mild sense of unease nibbled at his gut, Kase smirked. He'd beaten his record of consistent flying time since the crash. It was the only good thing he could say about the last few days. Stars, how much further was this pass? The range didn't end, and each peak merged into the next without a break. How would he even know where the pass was? What did it look like? He should probably ask Hallie. Or maybe he wouldn't ask. Things were still a little awkward after their fireside confessions. Kase didn't know what to say, and apparently she didn't either. It was strange not having anything to fight about. He didn't think her ridiculous at all. If he'd been in her shoes, he'd have done the same thing. Actually, he was doing the same thing. He wasn't on this mission for some noble cause. Yet Kase was the worst of them all, no matter what Hallie thought. To his right, a bit of sky opened between two peaks. Was that the pass? He steered toward it. The space grew and filled with light the further they flew. That had to be Haddon's Pass. It was closer than the map said, but then again he hadn't been able to pinpoint exactly where they even were. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you earlier," Skibbs said, his voice ringing out above the air whistling past Kase's ears. Kase's gaze didn't leave the growing gap in front of them. "About what?" "You know what." He knew exactly what Skibbs was talking about, but now wasn't the time to discuss Skibbs's problems and Kase's thoughts about them. They had an airship to fly. His heart rate picked up. "Don't lose your temper. Don't do something stupid while you're flying this hover." "Kase." He stared straight ahead. He didn't trust his mouth to follow his mind's orders. While the last few days had been tense, Kase had been able to keep his temper in check. It wouldn't do to ruin it all now. All he needed to do was take a deep breath, or 5. He needed to focus. He couldn't lose himself to his anger, or his fear. "You think I'm a platinum-class stars idiot, so spit it out." "Breathe. Breathe slowly. Just be honest with me, please." "Fine, you're a platinum-class stars idiot," Kase spat. "Happy?" Skibbs was silent. Kase steered the ship into the gap and saw several trees rising above the rest. They were oddly shaped, skinny and branchless, but nothing surprised him on Tassila anymore. "That's it?" Skibbs asked. "You want me to elaborate on your stupidity?" No response. "It's not even that you knocked her up," Kase continued, his temper swelling, words leaking out like water breaking a weakened dam. "It's that you abandoned her afterward, and for what? A handful of gold hunters? You don't—" Kase cut him off, whipping his head toward him, his face on fire. His fear disappeared, burned up by his anger. "I don't care that you came from a poor family. I never blasted cared, but you think it means you aren't worthy or something equally stars ridiculous? This is you trying to buy your way into deserving her— Kase, my steering control— No, you don't get to speak. You don't get to talk. You wanted me to say something, so I will. You want to know what I think? What I really think?" Kase gripped the steering control so hard he was sure his knuckles would start bleeding any moment. "You're a blasted helveter for leaving Lucy and your kid behind to go on this suicide mission. Blast the money. You're a worthless piece of trash if you— Kase, watch out!" Kase whipped his head around to see them heading straight for a column of shining brown stone above the treetops. The strange trees he'd noticed before. Every single organ below his collarbone soared into his throat, choking him as he yanked the steering control up. But it wasn't enough. The left side of the Eudora Jade scraped against the column, and screams echoed down the corridor. He gritted his teeth as the ship ricocheted off another nearby column on the right side. "Blast!" Kase yelled as he overcorrected to the other side. "Press the hover buttons, now!" Skibbs pounded them, but the ship didn't level them out. The blonde cursed. "It's not working!" "What?" The ship jerked under Kase and listed to the right. The right engine had gone out. "Not again!" "Bring it down!" Skibbs kept smashing the hover buttons, and while they flickered once, they refused to stay on. Kase scanned the ground for any clearing large enough to accommodate a crash landing, but the sea of gold and red didn't falter. In the trees, then. He hit the button for the mechanical parachute, praying it would still work. With a whoosh and a swift crack, it deployed. As the left engine sputtered out and the ship's nose turned downward, the air caught in the parachute, slowing the ship's descent into the tree canopies. With a lurch that strained the limits of his safety belt, the ship caught in the branches, groaning to a halt. His heart pounded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I almost killed us, because I lost my temper." He cursed, but the bulbous plops of vomit hitting the floor of the cockpit cut the rest of the words off. A branch nearly as thick as his entire torso impaled the seat beside him. "Ben!" Another plop. I'm fine." Kase's vision blurred again as he ripped off his goggles and slung them toward the dash. They skipped across the buttons and knobs, the lens cracking before they fell out of the cockpit window. The sharp taps grew fainter as they fell from the tree. He undid his buckles and stood, his hand grasping the back of his pilot's chair. His shoulder burned from where the belt had dug into it. "Kase! Kase!" His brother's voice was 3 octaves too high. Footsteps. The ship lurched, and Kase caught himself on his steering control. He hugged his body to it, his feet slipping and trying to find a foothold. Holy moons and shocks, the ship was going to fall! Something cracked. Whether it was the tree or something within the ship, Kase didn't know, nor did he truly want to find out. "Stop!" he gasped as the ship rocked back toward the tree. Think. "Get some rope, and everyone else into the cockpit, now! Hurry!" His feet finally found solid footing. "Got it!" Zeke called back. Kase turned to the limb impaling the seat and Skibbs, who'd crawled under it. Kase's throat tightened. I'm... Skibbs shook his head. "No, it's not your fault. We're in a blasted tree because I couldn't keep my temper." Skibbs wiped his mouth and shook his head. "I deserved it. Not the tree thing, but you're right." Kase swiped at the tears escaping his tight hold. He didn't trust himself to say anything else, so he just nodded. They were alive. He needed to focus on that. He got on his knees, joining Skibbs, and faced the entrance. The others arrived, unhurt except for a few bruises and scratches. Hallie's arm seemed to be the worst, a sloppy bandage wrapped around the upper part. She'd also grabbed her satchel. "Mother of Ash, does she go anywhere without that thing?" Just a scratch," she squeaked when she noticed him looking. Ebba's eyes widened to the size of his mother's fanciest tea saucers when she spotted the giant limb stuck through the back of the co-pilot's chair. "What in the Stern and Sons happened?" Kase glanced at Skibbs. "I distracted him." His friend's face was stoic. "Our engines went out, electricity and all, and we hit some sort of metal column thing in the trees. Kase's quick reflexes saved us." "What do you mean, her engines went out?" Ebba growled. "I checked those myself this morning." Kase shook his head. "I don't know what happened, but we have to get off, now, before it falls with us in it." Zeke nodded and crawled forward. "I'll go first and help people out on the other side." With each movement, the ship creaked, and Kase winced. "Carefully!" After Zeke inched his way over, he squeezed Kase's shoulder. "Thank you." Kase didn't look him in the eye. He couldn't. With the precision of a practiced thief, Zeke made his way onto the sturdy branch of the tree, one of the swords tied on his back. "You had time to grab that?" "Kase, focus, please." He nodded and sucked in a breath as the ship creaked once more.
"Ebba? On it!"
Like an acrobat, she gracefully crossed the space from the entrance to the dash. Quite a feat, as she still had one arm in a sling. In a moment, she was through the cockpit window and on the limb with his brother. He turned back to Hallie.
"Come on, you next."
She shook her head.
No, Ben can go."
Kase's already high blood pressure flared, but he bit back his retort.
"Now's not the time to argue. Fine."
Still pale from his near-death experience, Skibbs followed the path the others had tread. Zeke helped him out and onto a separate branch. When Kase was sure Skibbs was stable, he turned back to Hallie.
"Your turn."
She bit her lip and played with the edge of the bandage on her arm.
"What if I fall?"
Kase closed his eyes.
"Calm. Getting angry is what got us into this mess. Listen, I'd rather not do this either, but we have to. The ship could fall any second, and we need to get into the tree before it does."
See? He could be calm and collected. When Hallie didn't move, Kase swallowed his frustration and held out his hand.
"Do you trust me?"
Tears formed in the corner of Hallie's eyes. She stared at his hand, then back to him.
"I'm scared."
Kase took his hand back and shouted to Zeke.
"Tie the rope to the tree and toss it to me."
Zeke grunted his reply, and Kase looked back at Hallie.
"I'll tie the rope around you as a failsafe. Will that help?"
A barely imperceptible nod. As Kase stood to grab the rope, the ship lurched once more, and the crack of a tree branch echoed through his skull. The floor tilted. Kase fought to grab the rope and pull himself to safety, but in a single moment he found Hallie's widened, terrified eyes. He let go, diving for her as the Eudora Jade plummeted to the ground below. Chapter 18. An Invisible Beat. Hallie. Cold wetness was the first thing Hallie felt when she opened her eyes. That and ow! She grimaced, but that only worsened the pounding ache in her head, as did the raindrops pelting her eyes. The ground was soft beneath her back.
"Hold still. I'm almost done bandaging your head,"
a deep voice said. Zeke, possibly. Hallie blinked again, and the world came into clearer focus. Zeke indeed hovered above her, tying off the last bit. He sat back, his hair damp and messy for once.
"You had me scared for a moment there. What else hurts?"
Sitting up, she put a hand to her throat. It felt raw, like she'd been screaming for hours. She wiped the raindrops from her face and inspected her hand. It wasn't until she saw the blood mixed with the water that she felt the pain of it.
What happened?" "We survived falling out of a tree. Barely."
Someone groaned near her. Kase swam into focus, sitting beside her, flinching every time he rubbed a dirty rag across his blood-streaked face, his curls matted with red. Hallie gasped.
"Kase, how are you? All that blood." "Looks worse than it is. Not that it doesn't hurt, but we got lucky."
A sharp something smacked against metal, and Hallie jumped, groaning as pain spiked through her skull. Searching for the source of the sound, she put a hand to her head. A little way behind her lay the remains of the once great airship. One blackened engine, the one closest to her and bent at the wrong angle, was barely connected to the ship's core. Ebba ran a hand through her hair and gave the thing another kick. It gave off a tiny spark but went dark almost immediately. She explained something to the nearby Ben, who shrugged and picked up a scrap near his feet. A string of Ebba's down-country curses followed. Hallie swallowed, biting her lip to keep from crying. They'd survived, somehow. She vaguely recalled the ship tilting and Kase lunging for her, but she must have hit her head after that. She didn't remember anything else.
"How long have I been out?"
Zeke shrugged.
"Not too long. I haven't been back inside the ship to grab anything. It looks stable enough to use as a shelter for at least one night, but Ebba still hasn't figured out why the engines died."
Hallie chewed her lip.
She'd have to trust Ebba and her assertion she could fix anything. Stars. Hallie remembered thinking that the woman was conceited for saying something along those lines in Professor Christie's office, but she had yet to let them down. Closing her eyes, she ran a hand over the spot where her pocket watch should have rested against her chest, but only sodden lace met her fingers. She gasped, eyes snapping open. "My pocket watch! Where is it?" Case groaned and reached into his jacket pocket. "Is this it?" In his hand, the small, rounded trinket sat. The chain that kept it around her neck fell down the sides and in 2 pieces. He held it out to her. "It probably snapped when we fell." She reached forward and took it from his palm. When her fingers kissed cool metal, relief warmed her chest. The outside was the same as ever, with its smoothed ridges. Jack's voice rang in her ears as she inspected every inch for scratches. "Papa gave it to me and said I could wear it on a chain to school. Wonder if I can fix it." The ends of her lips tipped up as she remembered her brother attempting to open the back. It had been sealed shut with no visible seams to fix the broken cogs. With each unsuccessful attempt, Jack's boyish face had grown redder and redder. He didn't seem to mind much after that, only proud to carry around such a precious heirloom. She popped open the cover. The watch was simple, dust and age fogging the edges of the glass. Numbers laced in gold rimmed the edges of the face, and long, elegant hands ticked along with an invisible beat. The hands ticked along with an invisible beat. Hallie gasped and blinked, hard. Her vision blurred. Another blink. Her hands shook as she smoothed a finger over the face. So all the watch needed was a good whacking to work? That didn't make a lick of sense. The minute hand slid to the next miniature hash as the second hand reached the 12. "What is it?" Zeke asked, eyes searching for any other injuries. Case, who had resumed mopping the blood at his hairline, froze. Hallie shook her head and closed the cover. "Nothing. It's just later in the day than I thought." Case narrowed his eyes, but he didn't comment. He saw straight through her lie. She glanced away. "It's late afternoon, but that's only by my estimate. These rain clouds came out of nowhere." Zeke stood, dusting his trousers off. He glanced back toward the Eudora. "When we saw the ship fall..." He waited a moment, as if trying to gather his thoughts. "I've never been so relieved than when Case crawled out the window with you in his arms. It's a miracle you both survived." Hallie looked down and then at Case, who was too intent on cleaning his already clear face. In fact, a bit of dirt and blood from the rag streaked his forehead with the last swipe. He'd saved her? She thought back once more to the last few moments before the ship fell. Case had grabbed the rope. He'd been about to pull himself out, but he'd gone back for her instead. Her voice wobbled as she inspected the muddy ground littered with autumn's last leafy remnants, her now working pocket watch still clutched in her fist. "Thank you." She wanted to add, "for saving my life," but she couldn't form the words. Instead, she found Case's blue eyes. He rested a hand on her boot and squeezed softly. "You're welcome." Zeke cleared his throat, and Hallie broke eye contact with Case. The soldier straightened the sleeves of his dirt-streaked uniform. "I'm going to inspect those tower things Ben said you crashed into, Case. Will you lead me?" Hallie's heart sped up a little. "Can I go too? With us being in the pass, I assume they're Yalvin-made." Zeke shrugged as Case stood. Hallie stashed her watch in a trouser pocket and pushed herself to her feet, but her head gave a painful throb as she did, throwing her off balance. Within seconds, Case's hand was at her back. "Thanks," she mumbled. "You probably shouldn't stand." Hallie gritted her teeth as another painful throb pounded against her skull. "I think you're right. I'm always right." Hallie snorted and instantly brought a hand to her head, cursing herself silently. "I'll be fine as long as we walk slowly." Zeke cleared his throat again. and Case's hand fell away from the small of her back. She hadn't realized it was still there. "So where are these structures?" Ben ambled over a second later. He took one look at Case's head and grimaced. "Don't think that improves your looks, mate." Case grumbled something under his breath, but Hallie didn't catch it. She smiled at Ben instead. "We're off to inspect the towers, or whatever you all saw." "I'll come along too." Zeke turned to Ebba and shouted, "You want to come inspect what Case hit with the ship?" A loud curse followed along with another kick to the ship. "I'm staying here with Eudora, or don't you want her fixed up?" Zeke sighed. "I'll stay behind. She won't be able to keep watch. You all go on ahead since it isn't too far. Don't push yourselves." With that, Ben led them through the trees. Hallie's legs groaned at the exercise, but she kept pace as best she could. Not that it was easier when Case walked just at her elbow, ready to catch her lest she fall. A month ago it would have annoyed her, but with her head throbbing with each step she took, she was grateful for his presence. Funny how things changed so quickly. After at least a quarter hour of walking, a brown shape came into view, a pillar of solid stone soaring above the trees, its slick surface shimmering in the light peeking through the clouds. Like the ship, and the sword, and the dust that had always settled in Niels's blonde hair. Stars, if this was Yalvin, they sure had a good bit of Zuprium to spare. Hallie's brain might have hurt, but her thoughts dashed a mile a minute. Could it be another type of temple? Maybe a shrine? It wasn't natural, and the ship hitting it had caused the engines and electricity to go out. Interesting. Intriguing, actually. And then there was the subject of her dormant pocket watch coming to life. Through pain and even a little fear, a flicker of curiosity ignited in her chest. She was a scholar, after all. She thought back to the High Guardsman's words about their intelligence on the Alves. No contact in 20 years. Could this tower be part of the reason? Or maybe it had something to do with the essences. How else would something be able to knock out the airship's power? The texts Jade possessed on the topic never went into detail about what exactly the essences could do, only that they were something to be feared. Not helpful at the moment. Ben circled the structure, but Case stood at a distance. "All I know is that I scraped it and the engines shut off. I wouldn't get too close." "Nonsense." Hallie stumbled toward it, ignoring Case's protests. She grinned. "It's most certainly Yalvin. It has to be." Ben stopped his circling and rejoined Case. "It's not emitting any heat or light, just plain Zuprium, except for the carvings." Standing at the bottom of the pillar, Hallie looked up as rain fell, just a small sputtering. She inspected the stone with narrowed eyes. Ben was right. The massive bricks were carved with tiny patterns. No, not a pattern, words. She went to grab her sketchbook from her satchel, only for her hand to find the soaked canvas of her trousers. "Blast it, my satchel! Is it still on the ship?" Case shrugged. "I only grabbed the watch because it seemed valuable. Sorry." "What do you need?" Ben asked, stepping toward her, hand going into his jacket pocket. Hallie looked back at the towering column and then turned. "I need to copy this and check it against my—" Her words trailed off as Ben took something from his pocket. A small, red-lettered something with Yalvin scrawled across the front. Her heart picked up in pace, beating against her throat. "Found this on the floor of the cockpit when I went in to make sure the structure was stable. This particular book has been banned for nearly 20 years. Yet somehow a copy shows up on our ship." Hallie swallowed her unease. "I found that in the bookshop I used to work in before I decided to come along on this mission, and I thought it might help us. I didn't realize it was banned. Jess has never been one to look at the books he sells too closely." Ben held it out to her, and she took it. Case frowned. "What's that on the cover?" Hallie brushed away a few stray drops from the leather. The rain had simmered to a heavy mist. "Not sure, but the title says, 'The Gate of Time.'" Ben smiled. You really are a good sun's-blasted scholar. I'm glad Joe found you. Even I wouldn't have been able to read that title if I hadn't known what the cover looks like. Shocks and bolts. Kase fingered his electro-pistol and sighed. While I would never want to stop a book discussion, I think we should hurry and head back. Blasted things are giving me bad vibes. Alli tucked the book under her arm and leaned in, closer to the column. The writing was as old as the inscription above the archway back at the temple armory, yet a few words stood out to her. Essence. Gate. Time. Had the Yalvs simply scrawled their history upon the metal? She glanced down at the book. With so much going on, she hadn't gotten to read much. She really hadn't felt like it, with the translating of each word taking time. Professor Christie's words echoed in her mind. There's a reason no one's been able to contact the Yalvs in 2 decades, and there's a reason why that book in the package has been banned everywhere. She shook her head to clear it, though pain spiked at the back. She stumbled, dropping the book and throwing out her hand to break her fall. Metal, slick and cool with rain and the promise of winter, met her hand. Carvings bit into her palm. A sense of calm fell upon her. Alli! Kase's voice was lost in the wind, picking up the edges of her head bandage and hair, swirling, twirling, ripping out the ribbon she'd used to tie it up. She gasped, and Kase shouted her name again. She tried to pull away, but she couldn't move her hand from the column. Pain like golden lightning spiked throughout her entire body. Without anything else keeping her upright, she collapsed to the ground, and the world went dark. Kase. Kase had only whittled away badly at the wet stick for a short time before Alli woke. He was surprised by how relieved he was when she did. He told himself it was because he didn't know how to whittle, and she'd saved him from probably slicing himself with the knife, but it was more than that. He'd been worried when she'd blacked out after running from the dragon, sure, but that paled in comparison to the way she'd crumpled after catching herself with the strange pillar. Despite his best efforts, they'd finally reached a good place, so she wasn't allowed to die on him now. Her eyes were bright in the dim light filtering through the busted window of the women's chamber. When he and Ben had gotten her back to camp, his brother had settled her in here, and Kase hadn't left her side since. He couldn't. Not after everything. She blinked again as she took in Kase sitting by her bed in the little wooden chair. It was almost too small for him. While he wasn't as broad-shouldered as his brothers, he was tall, and the back of the chair only reached the middle of his spine. He'd inherited his mother's build, but his father's height. His mother had told him he favored her older brother, but Kase despised the comparison. Thinking about him only brought up terrible memories of what the man had done. Alli finally spoke, her rasping voice dragging him out of that place. What happened? Kase helped her sit up and handed her a canteen, which she sipped from daintily, her lips perched about the edge like a proper lady. Stars, no, why was he thinking about her lips? He took the vessel back from her and screwed the top back on. What do you remember? Alli winced, putting a hand to her head as she adjusted her position, but she waved off his offer to help. I touched the pillar. Yeah, you decided to fall into it. Whatever. Alli reached down and snagged her satchel from where it lay at the end of her bed, searching through it. Kase had gathered the supplies and brought it into the room, thinking it might help her wake up. Probably stupid, but he didn't know what else to do. Alli continued. Guess I'll have to sketch it and do research when we get... Her words choked off, but Kase finished them for her. We'll find a way. A bitter, empty promise, but he didn't know what else to say. Stars, idiot. They were all screwed if they stayed. He was screwed if they made it home. And they didn't even have a functioning ship. Alli chewed on her lip. With what airship? Not that I'd ever get on one again. At least you're still alive. Kase threw his poor misshapen stick through the jagged hole in the window. It smacked against a nearby tree trunk. Whittling was useless. "Thank you. Again?" Alli played with the edges of her notebook, not meeting his eye. "Most people don't make it to crash landing number 2, much less live through it, nor survive the ship falling out of a tree." The pressure in his chest only swelled as she flipped through the pages in her notebook, the soft whisking of her fingers across the parchment getting louder with each second that passed. "It was my fault," he said. He didn't know why, but he did. "Skibbs lied to cover up the fact I messed up." Hallie's fingers paused. Kase couldn't stop now he'd started. "I tore into him about the whole Lucy thing, about how much of a piece of blasted trash he was for leaving her and coming out here. I wasn't paying attention. That's when we hit the column. It's my fault. My fault we're stranded with no way... He stopped when her slender fingers grasped his hand and squeezed it. He looked up to find her eyes boring into his. They were like pools of gold, the brown and jade specks glowing in the little light they had left in the day. She didn't say anything for several moments. He wanted to cower, wanted to pull his hand out of her grasp, but her eyes were the only thing keeping him from falling apart. "Kase, it's okay." "But..." She brushed her thumb across his knuckles. He stifled a shiver. "At this point, we have no option but to make it to Marai and pray the elves can get us home. That, or hope Ebba can pull a miracle out of her back pocket. Both are viable. I've decided to put my faith in that." How can you be so confident? Because I don't have a choice, Kase. Neither do you. She gave his fingers one last squeeze before going back to her notebook. Kase stared at the floor, sifting through her words. What did they have to lose now? Maybe Ebba could do something to fix up the ship. He didn't know how long that would take, but she was the best mechanic he'd ever known. He'd rather put his confidence in her than the Yalvs, but at this point Alli was right. There wasn't another option, and Kase was never one to roll over without a fight. The memory of Harlan's fist flashed in his mind. He shut his eyes and took a deep breath. No, Kase had never backed down from a fight, no matter what the outcome might have been for him. Closing his eyes, Kase listened to the strokes as Alli sketched. While the noise might have irked him a month ago, it calmed him now. The same could be said of Alli herself. She no longer antagonized him at every turn. He opened his eyes and peeked over at her notepad. She was talented. Whenever Kase tried anything like that, not even he could tell what it was supposed to be. Maybe if they all survived, he'd bully Alli into teaching him. How long was I out this time? Alli wouldn't look at him. Don't you have a pocket watch? Oh, yeah, right. She dug around in her satchel, pulling it out. Peering at it, she frowned. I don't think I'd trust it. Says it's 9. I think the crash did something to it. Kase ran a hand down his face and grimaced at the prickly stubble. We've been back 20 minutes or so, but that's a guess. She added a few more touches to her drawing and held it up. What do you think? He took it from her and inspected it. Her skill shone through, even if it was a rough sketch. His eyes widened. You said you only remembered touching the pillar, but this is so detailed. Huh? Alli took it back. I guess I remember more than I thought. That's ancient Yalvin writing. It's similar to what I've studied in my classes. Can you read it? Not easily. I could study it for a bit and figure it out, but the Yalvin language has evolved immensely in the millennium, and only bits and pieces of the original tongue are the same. A few of the words are familiar enough. This reminds me of that place with the swords. Kase looked in the direction of the pillar, though the forest hid it from their view. Me too. That's why I think they're connected. Hallie took her notebook back and stashed it in her satchel. I want to go closer again to see if I can figure out what it says. That's a terrible idea. I won't touch it. Forgive me if I'm skeptical. She rolled her eyes. I promise not to touch the scary pillar thing, lest I black out for the 500th time on this mission. Is that good enough for you? Kase answered her smile with one of his own. Thank you. Now, if you're up for it, let's go eat. Skibbs was trying to pull something together last I heard. He's terrible at it, but I'm sure anything he comes up with will be better than any of your meals. She glared at him for a second before laughing softly. You're not wrong. She swung her feet over the side of the bed and stood. They were possibly stuck here without a way back home, but a strange thought flitted across his exhausted mind. There isn't anyone else I'd rather be stranded with, I don't think. Chapter 19. Let Go. Hallie. As it turned out, the evening only brought more rain, meaning no fire for the night or the hot dinner Ben had been assembling. But Hallie wasn't too upset, because her head ached from where she'd hit it in the fall. The only problem was that with the onset of night and her previous run-in with the pillar, no one would let her inspect it once more. Instead, she rummaged through her trunk, trying to find the Gate of Time. Kase said he'd carried her back from the pillar and put it in her trunk as she slept. But it wasn't there. She didn't think Kase would lie about something like that, but then again, where was the book? Instead of finding her quarry, she did discover the bag of caramels she'd stuffed there the first day. The bag was crinkled and slightly torn, but it was in better shape than the airship. Even with the light rain outside the broken window, Ebba's occasional curse still filtered in. She'd refused to come out from under the ship for nearly an hour after the precipitation doused Ben's budding campfire, and she was still at work. Gracious day, was she ever going to admit defeat? Hallie had to give her credit for perseverance, but at this point the Eudora Jade was a lost cause. The crew's only chance of getting home once more was through the Yalv's help, if they chose to give it. Her chest tightened, and she squeezed the bag of caramels, the brown paper crinkling. They were never getting home, and all she'd left her parents was a blasted letter. That wouldn't make up for the loss of a child, even one they hadn't seen since she'd said goodbye over 2 years prior. Deep breaths. I'm on this mission to treaty with the Yalvs. If anyone can do it, I can. If she told herself that enough, maybe she would believe it. She'd just set aside the caramels when she was thrown sideways. A loud boom deafened her momentarily, followed by curses from Ebba outside the window and shouts from the corridor. What in the blazes are you doing? Zeke's voice echoed off the walls. More footsteps joined his. Ebba's voice was even higher. Were you trying to kill me? I was underneath Eudora trying to fix whatever you did to her. Someone answered, and Hallie left her room. Up the corridor, the raised voices came from the food closet. She peeked around the frame to find the rest of the crew. Grease and soot covered much of Ebba's skin and clothing. Zeke's arms were crossed. It was Ben and Kase who looked worse for wear. The watch agent's face was stained black, his eyebrows missing, and Kase, well, his hair was messier than normal. He still had both eyebrows. Beside Ben sat the ruins of some contraption or other. With it being burnt, busted, and otherwise destroyed, Hallie had no clue what it had been in its previous life. We found this burner to help make dinner, Kase said, pointing to the ruined device. Skibbs thought he could do something to the wires to make it work because it runs on electricity, but obviously... Zeke's eyes turned cold. If the blasted ship doesn't work, why did you think this would? Kase glanced at Ben, who wiped what he could off his face with the sleeve of his jacket. The blonde spoke up. I might have had one of my moments when working with the wires. Ever since I hit my head during the storm, I should have known better than to try. Sorry, Zeke. Ebba. Her gaze caught on Kase, his blue eyes flashing and contrasting with Zeke's level stare. Did the latter ever lose his temper? She'd always assumed it was the military training, but now it bothered her. He didn't need to be like Kase, with every emotion spilling over like wine on a white tablecloth, but keeping the emotion in must have been draining him, especially on this terrible mission. Both Ebba and Ben left, the former grumbling obscenities under her breath as she passed. Alli turned to follow them out when Kase spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. "What exactly did you give Skibbs to heal him?" His right hand gripped the edge of the counter. "Because it isn't working." Zeke's tone matched his brother's. "What he needed? Then why isn't it working?" Kase grabbed the lapels of his brother's shirt. "Did you mix medicines or something? What did you give him?" Zeke pried his brother's hands off him. "There's no need to lose your head over a standard military medical practice." "Tell me what you gave him." Kase straightened his own shirt as Zeke did his. "Yes, please explain," Alli said. Kase turned. "You don't need to get involved." "This concerns all of us. Of course I need to get involved." Kase looked like he wanted to say something more, but thought better of it. She filed that away for later examination. "Please, just tell us." Zeke cleared his throat. "With his condition, I did what I had to, so I gave him the standard pain reliever, as well as a few other medicines to heal his internal injuries." "Like what exactly?" Kase growled. "Like serotane, almimphogen, and of course getasol and vatmine." Alli blinked. She'd never heard of any of those, but she stepped up beside the two instead of lingering by the door. She peeked back where Ben had left and looked up at Zeke. "I don't know much about medicines or how to mix them, but I'm not sure whatever you gave him was a good idea. It seemed to make him worse." Kase tugged his arm free. "You should have thought it through before you just up and gave him—" "I would never do something so stupid as mixing medicines that don't work well together." Zeke's nostrils flared. So there was emotion tucked somewhere inside. "And no one wants or needs your blasted opinion, Kase. You're only on this mission because of Jove's pity, because you shocking nearly killed someone, and you're too cowardly to face the consequences. I had something worthy to contribute." Kase had nearly killed someone? Kase snarled, lunging for his brother. She grabbed his arm and tugged hard, snapping, "Stop! This isn't helping anything." "Just because you're jealous of Jove doesn't mean you get to play God!" Kase shouted, his breaths coming out in sharp bursts. Hallie's eyes widened as she stepped back, wishing she'd never left her room. Kase had been right. This wasn't her fight. "Have you lost your ever-twinkling mind?" Zeke spat. "You don't get to spout off ridiculous accusations. You know I'm right. That's why you joined the military, isn't it? So you could be the favorite son? You hated living in Jove's shadow, and you didn't have the balls to call out Father when he lost his mind at Anna for trying to run away?" "Shut your mouth." Rage lit Zeke's gaze. "You have no blasted idea what you're talking about." Allie's breath caught. She should do something. She scanned the room, looking for anything she could use to help diffuse the situation, but how would old potatoes or dried beef help? "Enough," a low voice said from the doorway, and both brothers froze. "Whatever the moons you're fighting about has to stop. Now." Alli turned to find a mostly cleaned Ben. His eyebrows were indeed singed off. "Fighting like this won't accomplish anything. Now both of you, grow up." Kase's breaths were ragged as he pushed past the others, making sure to knock Zeke in the shoulder before heading up the corridor towards his chamber. Alli bit her lip and took a step after him before she stopped. She was probably the last person he wanted to see, and Zeke's words still rang in her ears. "Because you shocking nearly killed someone, and you're too cowardly to face the consequences." Her heart pounded. While the first half of the accusation was a shock, it was the latter half that struck true. Her face grew hot. Hadn't she done the same back in Stoneset? Zeke ran a hand through his hair and over his face. I'm sorry, Alli. Ben. I didn't mean to. I haven't lost my temper in so long. Kase has a way. Sorry. Everything with the ship, this mission, just give me a moment to compose myself. Without anything to do, Alli scampered back to her bedchamber. Ebba wasn't there, probably outside. She stared at her plain bed wrapped in a dull brown blanket, the caramels sitting on top. She schooled her face into one of indifference, desperately trying to compose herself. Tensions were clearly high, and another breakdown wouldn't help anyone, least of all her. She replayed Zeke's and Kase's words in her mind once more. Passion and frustration drenched each syllable. It was so unexpected of Zeke. Another blow-up between her and Kase had been far more likely, not one between him and the ever-calm soldier. Stars! She stared at the caramels as both Ben and Zeke headed out of the ship, their footsteps too loud in her head. Sitting down on her coverlet, she pulled her knees up to her chest. What a terrible, blasted mess they were in. They might never get home. They might die out here in the wilds of Tassova, and no one would ever know their story. Another loud bang crashed her melancholy thoughts. Without any curses filtering through her window from Ebba, nor footsteps, it could only be one person, the one with a temper to rival her own. Making her way into the corridor and peeking around the frame to the men's chamber, Alli frowned when she found Kase lying on his back, arms stretched over his eyes. He'd nearly killed someone. She flinched when he hit the wall again with his fist. She took a hesitant step forward, but pulled back and hid before she even made it over the threshold. She pressed her back against the cool metal, squeezing her eyes shut. He didn't need her barging in on his misery. When he hit the wall again, she pushed herself off and headed straight for her own chamber. Better to let him simmer in silence. She was sure he had an explanation for everything. The Kase she'd come to know through bits and pieces wasn't someone who'd... Ignoring another fist to metal from Kase, she tossed her coat on her bed and dug through her trunk. Her search was fruitless yet again. The Gate of Time was most definitely not in her trunk. Kase must have remembered wrong. The book was probably ruined with rain beside the pillar. She sighed, turning her attention back to the caramels. If there ever was a time to eat them, it was now. She'd barely touched them, even at her hungriest. Sitting on her bed, she untied the string holding the bag closed and played with one of the candies. That fight had been bad. Worse than anything she or Kase had ever argued over. What if Zeke had seriously hurt Ben with those medicines? What if he never recovered? Was that essentially Zeke's fault? He was a trained medic, but... A small clatter interrupted her thoughts. Alli tossed the caramel back into the bag and turned to where she'd heard the sound. Jack's pocket watch had fallen from where she'd laid it on the edge of the bed frame. Alli picked it up and inspected it. The ridges of the front calmed her, and she opened it. She half expected the thing to quit working once more, but the hand still moved. It said it was only 1 o'clock, which was incorrect. With a shrug, she stuffed it into her trouser pocket. She'd worry about it later. Another bang reverberated throughout the ship. I can't fault him for being upset, at least, though if he keeps it up, he might damage the ship further. Eyeing the paper bag at the end of the bed, she had an idea. Possibly a laughable one, but concentration was out the window if Kase kept the noise up. She grabbed the bag of caramels and walked towards the men's chamber. Just outside, she squared her shoulders, then knocked lightly on the doorframe. Go away, Zeke. Kase punctuated his words with another slammed fist. Right, dumb idea. It's Alli. She twisted a strand of hair from her braid and moved into his view. She hadn't had the will to do it in a lady's bun after the crash. I have something for you. I'll leave it, I'll leave it on the bed. Sorry to bother. Kase let his arm fall away from his face, tilting his head up to frown at her. A paper bag? Was that supposed to help? He's not mad at me. Alli stepped into the room. You like caramels? That's what's in here. If you don't, no worries, and I'll just go back to... She cleared her throat. Sorry. I'll go now. Before she turned away, Kase sat up and swung his legs off the side of the bed, pushing the mess of blankets aside. You brought me caramels? She nodded, flushing under Kase's discerning gaze. She gripped the bag harder. I haven't eaten many of them. You can have the rest. He stared at her several seconds too long, and she swallowed. Her mind told her to leave, but her feet wouldn't obey. Zeke's accusation rang in her ears. Kase, did you really almost... What Zeke said about you, and, just go. Drop the caramels and leave. Kase worked his jaw for a moment. Hallie's stomach tightened. It wasn't my fault. Not really. She didn't move. He ran both hands over his face and leaned back against the wall. It's complicated. The crews have an unofficial induction ritual. The last one ended with a greenie paralyzed from the waist down, and I volunteered to take the blame for it, thinking the Shackley name would protect me. Conceited, I know. She swallowed, tightening her grip on the bag. Is that all? One of his blue eyes peeked out. If our mission isn't successful, meaning I don't prove my worth as a pilot, I'll be... My father's kicking me off the cruise, and... He hid behind his fingers once more. I'll end up facing charges, and if I somehow escape punishment from that, I'll probably be forced to join the army. Probably only to die in that blasted war Jove hinted at. Oh, she whispered. For a moment she considered turning around and leaving again, but as she did, Kase's moment of indecision right before the Eudora fell flashed in her mind. She'd been so terrified by that look, seeing how badly he wanted to pull himself to safety, thinking she'd die alone because she wasn't important enough to save. Not to the Lord Pilot, not to anyone. But then he'd let go. Let go. Jack's voice echoed in her mind. The corners of her eyes burned, and she blinked away the water clouding her vision. Let go. Even though her stomach was wrenched tighter than her mother's twisted bun, she padded over and took a seat next to Kase, bag still in her fist. She held it out and mumbled, They'll make you feel better. Promise? Taking it from her, he snorted softly. I guess it's as good a try as any. I do love caramels. He pulled one out and handed it to her. She shook her head. No, it's fine, really. They're for you. Kase raised an eyebrow. You brought an entire bag of sweets on this mission, only to eat... He peeked inside. You haven't eaten any of these, have you? I did. I had 2. I don't believe that one bit. Not that I'm complaining. You know, this wouldn't have lasted the day if it had been in our room. Regardless, you can't let me eat them alone. She plucked it from his fingers. The knots in her stomach finally relaxed, and she leaned back against the wall. If you insist. Let go. She unwrapped the candy, the cellophane crinkling, and popped it into her mouth. She moaned as sweet, sugary goodness exploded across her tongue. Oh, good stars! I should have had more of these. Kase ate one of his own. This is the best thing I've ever eaten by light years. Alli grinned and took another, unable to stop herself now. She unwrapped it and tossed it in the air, trying to catch it in her mouth. It hit her cheek instead, dropping onto the floor. Oh, please, I can do better than that. Prove it, Lord Pilot. Kase threw it up and leaned backward to catch it, but the effort was for naught. It hit him in the eye. Ouch! That nearly blinded me. Alli laughed and grabbed another caramel. Someone needs to practice. If you'd shared these earlier, I could have been proficient by now. This is your fault, really. She threw the wadded wrapper at him and chewed the candy, savoring every bit of it. Once she'd swallowed, she smiled. Well, maybe I would have shared them earlier if you hadn't been such a dull cop. Kase quirked his eyebrow. Strong word for a gentle lady such as yourself. Alli snorted in a rather unladylike fashion. Me? A gentle lady? You must have me convinced with another Hallie Walker. Because I know so many. Of course. But for the record, I'm the best one. I don't doubt it. Alli grinned and took another. Enjoying the sugary treat and the camaraderie they'd found, she chewed for a moment. Kase unwrapped another and tossed it up in the air. This time he caught it with a satisfied grin. I believe the win goes to me, he said through sticky teeth. Alli rolled her eyes. You do know Odysseus paid for his excessive pride. With our luck, you just unleashed a horde of dragons upon us. I do what I can. You're impossible. It's true. I won't deny it. He took out another candy and held it in his fingers. Thank you. She pushed a bit of hair out of her face. For what? For this. And for... He held up the bag. You didn't run or anything when I was... Well, when I told you what happened. She fiddled with the hem of her shirt. The lace pattern, a line of aster flowers, was one of her favorites. It had been one of her first purchases upon arriving in the capital. You're not the only one who has done terrible things. You don't have to shoulder that burden alone. Kase's eyes were shadowed, but his words were strong. Thank you. A beat of silence, and like always, Alli couldn't stand more than that. She took another caramel. Tell me, if you've read Maracy, then you must have heard of Kaler. He specializes in other ancient literature, particularly Shakespeare, but he's wrong about some of his analysis of Julius Caesar, particularly when he goes through Brutus's speech. It wasn't until Alli was tucked into her bed hours later, after discussing all sorts of books and authors and eating so many candies her stomach was fit to burst, that she realized not once did they discuss the fact they might never return home. Not a single time did it cross her mind. She smiled into the pillow as she rolled over, content to listen to the soft nighttime sounds and the murmured voices of Ben and Zeke outside her broken window. It wasn't long before she fell asleep, the smile never leaving her face. Part 3. Gate. Interlude 2. Shattered Stars. Jove. The triumvirate argued for a week after the Lord Capitan's suggestion to assassinate the Cereline commander, Marcus Coria. Jove was sure he'd gained at least 5 gray hairs from these past few days alone, and they weren't his first. Clara teased him about them, saying his hair looked like someone had sprinkled salt on the side of his head. For star's sake, he wasn't even 30. Don't worry about your hair, love, Clara soothed, as Jove tried to pull his hat down to cover the grey strands. They rode through the city on their way to dinner at Shackley Manor. Mother had insisted, saying she wanted to talk with Clara about the baby. He wouldn't have cared so much about going if his brothers were also attending, or even some important dignitary, but no, it would just be Jove, Clara, and his parents. A private, cozy family affair. Wonderful. Jove quit fiddling with his bowler hat and peeked at his wife. You're just saying that because you're younger. Clara's laugh was like a songbird in spring. Be thankful. Not everyone is given the gift of growing old. Jove snorted. I guess you're right. Always am. Should have learnt that these past few years. What had he done to deserve her? Jove smiled, his first real one in days. His hand engulfed hers as he took it and pulled it onto his lap. It'll sink in eventually." She squeezed his hand. They didn't talk much the rest of the way, which allowed Jove to look out the window as the driver took them to the manor. Even though he usually preferred walking everywhere, Jove didn't want Clara to walk that far, especially at night. Besides, what was the point of having a prestigious name like Shackley if it didn't come with certain perks? Having a chauffeured motor coach was one of the best. As the evening mealtime approached, well-to-do families were already in their own spiraling estates, leaving many of the roadways clear. Several of the wealthiest had homes outside the city, but many of the buildings in Upper Kyvena were built higher instead of wider due to the space restriction. That didn't mean they weren't any less garish than their country estates. Probably more so. Jove liked his and Clara's little townhouse. Simple and practical. It felt more like home than anywhere else. Around this time in the lower city, people of all sorts would still be wandering around trying to find the best deals in the market, seeing a show at the public theater, or going to local taverns. Jove didn't enjoy going down to that part of the city. It was too dirty for him. But at that moment, he would have eaten in one of the dirtiest establishments of them all. Instead, he headed for one of the cleanest, most prominent estates in the city, his childhood home. "Jove," he grunted as he turned to his wife. She was biting her lip. She only did that when she was nervous. "Yes, love." He rubbed a thumb across the back of her hand. "Will you try not to fight with your father tonight?" Jove stiffened, pulling back his hand. "He's the one who usually starts it." She put her hands on her growing stomach. "I know, but your mother's been under a lot of stress with your brothers gone. Please, no matter what he says." Jove clenched his fist as he leaned his clean-shaven cheek against it, his elbow propped up on the door. He tried to blink back the memory of another fight so many years ago. It had been Kase who started it with their father, Jove only jumping in when Harlan's fist had... He shook his head to clear his thoughts. "I'll do my best." "Thank you." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but Clara took his free hand in hers once more. He didn't stop her. He knew she was always on his side, something he didn't want to take for granted. Once the motor coach pulled through the front gates, he pulled it away and tried to wipe off the sweat gathering in his palms. "Here we go," Jove muttered as a serving man came to the door, opening it for them. Jove got out first and turned toward his wife, grasping her fingers to ease her onto the cobblestones below. With a nod to the servant and the driver, Jove led Clara up to the front door and knocked. Taking a deep breath and smoothing the front of his jacket, Jove prepared to enter the lion's den.
"Oh, Les, your cook must give me the recipe for this canapé,"
Clara gushed as the group, including both Jove and Harlan, sat in the formal drawing room just before dinner would be served.
"I haven't been able to eat much since, the baby."
Jove's mother grinned, her soft blue eyes alight.
"Of course. And don't you worry about that. I remember I couldn't stand the smell of fish the entirety of my pregnancy with Kase. Well, that's not saying much, is it? No one really likes the smell of fish."
Jove grimaced at his mother's attempt at a joke, even if Clara laughed outright. She tried so hard to get into his mother's good graces. Marrying Zeke would have given her a better chance, as he was everyone's favorite, never caused problems. The perfect son. The room overflowed with wealth, as evidenced by the mahogany bookshelves framing the fireplace and the decadent glass figurines his mother loved to collect dotting the exposed surfaces. Each one twinkled in the light from the chandelier. Jove's favorite was the one of King Arthur on the side table. It was the only story he'd ever liked. Well, if it was read to him. He wasn't like Kase, always content to sit around getting lost in a dusty tome. Jove brought the brandy to his lips, the ice clinking against the fine-spun glass.
His father echoed his movements. All Harlan had said upon learning of the impending birth of his first grandchild was, "Thank you." Nothing else. Not a smile, no congratulations, just thank you. Jove still hadn't quite pieced together what that meant. No one else had understood either, it seemed. His mother had laughed it away in her nervous manner and peppered Clara with other questions, which his wife was happy to answer. Jove hadn't paid much attention, focusing more on his drink than anything else, and ignoring the canapé appetizers. At least if Kase had been there, he would have said something outrageous or embarrassing. Jove would have welcomed a sparring match against his younger brother with open arms if it had kept Harlan's silence at bay. Really, Harlan's response shouldn't have been that surprising. What else would Jove have expected? A smile? Popping a bottle of champagne? Nope. Just thank you.
Lord Capitan, High Guardsman, Ladies Celeste and Clara, dinner is served, the maid announced, punctuating her words with a deep curtsy.
Thank you, maid, Harlan said. At least he'd added another word to his response, even if he apparently didn't know or care to know what the maid's name was. Never mind that Zuri had been with them since Jove was in grammar school. Jove set his glass down on the side table before heading into the dining hall. Dinner was tolerable, if only for the women's chatter. He could never be truly comfortable in the room, with a long table, towering ceiling, and candlelit chandelier. No electricity in this sacred hall. He knew his mother had wanted to put the new technology in here, but Harlan had refused. Jove had a sneaking suspicion it was because of Uncle Ezekiel's treason having to do with electricity, but he wasn't sure. As Jove picked at his roast and traced the gilded swirls on the tablecloth with his index finger, he attempted to listen to Clara's conversation. At least his wife and mother were ignoring the wall of silence that was Harlan. Their chattering made the dinner slightly less unpleasant than he'd imagined it would be. And he'd kept his word to Clara, no fighting with the Lord Capitan. If he could make it another hour, he could go to sleep without a guilty conscience. But one bite into the decadent chocolate pie Jove would never have been able to pronounce the name of, Harlan struck the first blow.
I don't appreciate you challenging me in our meetings.
Harlan used a knife to cut the tip of his own dessert. He placed the morsel in his mouth with grace a swan would kill to achieve. Jove gripped his utensils tight enough that he thought he might have bent them. Slowly he set them down, lest he be tempted to stab the table or the pie. The women's conversation ground to a halt as he folded his expensive cloth napkin beside his dainty plate, lamenting the thought of not finishing the final course, and sent Clara a silent apology.
I'm sorry you feel that way.
Jove stared at his father.
However, I would suspect the High Council would frown upon us discussing sensitive information outside meetings. What I say in my own home need not be censored.
Jove glanced at Clara's pleading eyes and stood up from his chair.
Perhaps we can have a civil conversation about this in the drawing room.
Harlan set his knife and fork down along with his own napkin before standing up. The servant rushed forward to pull the chair back in after Harlan strode away from the table. Jove followed, running his tongue along his teeth. They couldn't even get through one night, one that was supposed to be joyful, celebratory. Jove and Clara were going to have a child. But no, Harlan had to make it about himself. As Jove closed the door on the two women, he barely heard his mother tell Zuri to put the rest of the pie in the icebox. The Lord Capitan led him into the drawing room, and Jove spotted his abandoned brandy glass before Harlan turned on him.
Now, let's have what you call a civil conversation, shall we?
Harlan crossed his arms. His mustache twitched.
You are not to contradict me in meetings. I'm High Guardsman, Lord Capitan. I'm there for a reason.
Jove tried to keep his tone even, and he was about as successful as he would have been at dragging a 12-ton boulder up a mountain. I was only stating facts that the Stradats needed to know. Harlot narrowed his eyes. Sarsen is waiting for any chance she can to depose me, and she's now got Richter on her side. Jove bit his tongue. He'd promised Clara. He and Harlan were having a simple conversation, nothing more. His earlier tone could be excused. Usually Harlan was all bluster in the beginning of any argument, and more often than not, Jove took the bait. But not this time. And then today you had the blasted nerve to go against my plan. Because he'd wanted to slaughter innocent people, using what special operation forces and spies Jade already had on the other side of the Nardens. The Lord Capitan wanted to destroy the city of Solidrid itself after Coria was dead, to show Seraline who really held power on Yalvara. Jove swiped at his brandy glass and drank the watery dregs. He swallowed, breathing heavily out of his nose. He needed more alcohol. I need to look impartial. Family ties can't get in the way of our jobs. I'd thought you'd understand that. Harlan slammed his fist against the wall near the bookshelf, rattling its contents. His hazel eyes blazed. Don't you dare give me that. You and the others would sit idly by and do nothing, while Seraline gains all that power. I'm the only one who would do anything about it. He didn't stop there. His father spat onto the green carpet, his spittle darkening the precious wool. That Yalv mission was my idea too, but apparently I have not one but 3 useless sons who take after their blasted uncle. Red filled his vision as Jove hurled his glass at the fireplace, where it smashed into 1,000 pieces. Useless! I made a name for myself. That was all me. I run the watch. Any restraint he might have had broke along with the glass. He pushed into Harlan's face. You made me send them. I was insane enough to go along with it, thinking it all for the survival of Jade. But they might be dead for all we know, and you don't care. You've never cared. If my brothers never come back, their deaths are on your hands, just like Anna's is. Just like Uncle Ezekiel's is. You only care about that stupid uniform and your own blasted pride. I refuse to be talked to in that way in my own house. I am your father. Harlan shoved him into the side table, the sparkling King Arthur figurine toppling over and crashing to the floor. Shards of glass like shattered stars winked in the light from the chandelier above. Jove stared at the pieces, working his jaw to hold back tears as anger and frustration coursed through his veins. His voice cracked as he spat. I don't have a father. He picked himself up and fled into the hallway where Clara and his mother waited. Before he could do anything rash, he strode toward the front door, yanking his coat from the hook. Apologies for the glass, Mother. Clara's footsteps tapped softly against the hand-painted tile as his mother called for the car. He calmed himself as best he could before turning. Sorry, I didn't keep my promise. She didn't say anything, only took his hand in hers. A minute later, the motor coach rumbled around to the front, and Jove helped her inside. He slid in and dug into his pocket, pulling out a cigarette and his lighter. Clara gave him a dark look. Just as he was about to tell the driver to head to the apartment, someone rapped at his window. He probably would have punched the feeble glass if it had been Harlan, but it wasn't, only an exhausted messenger. Jove opened the door. Sorry to disturb you, High Guardsman. I was tasked with delivering this to you. He bowed, handing Jove an envelope. Jove took it and turned it over. It was emblazoned with Hetty's personal seal, an owl against first moon. The messenger headed up the stairs to the manor. Jove squinted. It must have something to do with the High Council, then, if the man was taking a message to the Lord Capitan as well. What is it, love? Jove shrugged. It's from Hetty. He closed the door with a snap. To the townhouse, Avery, please. The driver nodded, and the coach jerked into motion. The stench of Yalvar fuel tickled Jove's senses as he stuffed the cigarette and lighter back into his pocket. It didn't help the fury still pulsing through his veins. He broke the seal and fished out the parchment inside. It was a short missive in Hetty's precise hand. Stradat Forrest Richter is dead. Foul play suspected.